Thank you very much, Jack. Yeah, really delighted to be here to moderate the panel today. As I'm sure nobody needs reminding, we are in the midst of transforming UK gambling regulation from one era to another. The proposals laid out in the white paper are in the process of being defined through a series of consultations, not to mention several other key developments that are going on in the world of gambling regulation. We will very briefly get into the conversation because there's a lot to discuss. As Jack mentioned, though, we're very keen to take on as many of your questions as we can. You should see somewhere on your GoToWebinar box an area to enter questions. If you do that, they'll find their way to me, and I'll ask the panel as many of them as we have time for. Other than that, let's get cracking. I will introduce the panel. As Jack said, my name is Joe Ewens. I'm the Global Managing Editor here at Vixio, and we're delighted to be joined by, in the order that I can see them, Tim Miller, Executive Director at the Gambling Commission, Bahar Adini, who's a partner at Harris Hagan and all-round expert on the legal side of things when it comes to gambling in the UK. Sarah Fox, who leads the Gambling and Lotteries team and has been in charge of the white paper at DCMS, and Dan Ward, partner at Regulus Partners, consultant, analyst, and all-around expert on policy, I would say, among other things, when it comes to gambling in the UK. So before we crack on to any specific issue, I think it's good to set the scene and talk about the lay of the land now and over the next year or so as we define the future, to quote the title of this webinar. Tim, if I could start with you, could you give us, as briefly as you're able, an idea of where we are in terms of consultations and what's to come from the Gambling Commission over the next few months?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone that's joined today. So as you know, we're in the middle of the first tranche of our consultations related to the white paper. I think they've got about just over a month or so to run. I think so far we've had, last time I checked, sort of around about 1,800 responses, and I expect many more to come. I think without kind of obviously prejudging any of that, sort of the initial look at some of those responses and the evidence they've provided, I think certainly starts to identify some of the areas where I suspect we will end up making some changes following the consultation. That's kind of what you would expect. You know, it's a genuine consultation, so we're using it as that correct opportunity to, you know, ensure that the way we implement the white paper is done as effectively as possible. And I think, you know, some of the areas that we'll be looking at where we've had evidence provided would be kind of the real value in, for example, including job titles as part of a financial risk check. As well, we've had some really useful input around some of the practical applications of the cross-selling requirements that we're consulting on when it comes to land-based, and how there may need to be some kind of flexibility as to how you apply them there. So to say, you know, expect, I think, probably some changes at the end of this consultation period. Probably worth saying that I think during this period, as well as the formal responses that we've had lots of really good engagement with people, and in particular, we've had some really positive, kind of helpful, and I think quite practical engagement with individual operators. We've really welcomed that. What that's likely to lead to in particular, I think, is establishing a sort of a working group that will look specifically at how you would operationalize particularly kind of financial risk checks in a way that, you know, are effective, that, you know, work well, and we're looking to kick that off shortly. We'll also be sort of as part of that exploring the kind of possibility perhaps of piloting some of these changes before they fully come into force. We recognise, particularly where you're reliant upon kind of technology, and particularly where you're reliant upon third parties like credit reference agencies, actually being able to trial these things first and iron out any issues before it fully comes into effect may well be helpful. So that's something we're looking at the moment. We've of course been working really closely with DCMS, and worth saying that none of our consultations on the white paper went out until DCMS confirmed that they were consistent with the white paper, and that will certainly be an approach that we will take as further consultations come out, that all of them, we will seek that assurance from colleagues in DCMS that what we're consulting on is in line with both the wording and the intent of the white paper. The next kind of tranche of consultations will be sort of as we go into the winter, probably sort of towards the end of November time. Our board will be sort of finalising what areas they will cover, but I think it will cover a range of areas like customer-led tools, for example. So we'll share more information as to what's going to be in there once we sort of make those final decisions.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Sarah, could you speak a little bit about the consultations that DCMS is in charge of and what's still to come in terms of what you're going to look at?
Yeah, sure. So in an amazing feat of coordination, we got 2 of our consultations out on the same day that Gambling Commission got theirs out in July, which was always kind of the committed timeline that we had. So we had the consultation on online slot stake limits that came out on the 26th of July. That is running until next Wednesday, the 20th of September. And then there's the land-based reform ones, which is running a bit longer because it covers a lot more ground than the online slot one. So that one closes on the 4th of October. We've had less responses than Gambling Commissions, not that this is a competition, but they are much more kind of specific areas, and we'll get the kind of more detailed responses in the closer we get to those deadlines, I'm sure. We then have one more consultation that we're looking to launch, which is on the statutory levy. We'd always said that that one would take a little bit longer because it was actually kind of less developed within the white paper itself in terms of how it would operate, even though the voluntary levy is obviously in place at the moment. And we're hoping to get that out in the next few weeks. We're just about to go into conference recess, so that's just the thing that kind of we just need to tackle around timings. But definitely still keenness to get it out as soon as possible, and that will be quite a long consultation as well. But then it's important to say that the white paper isn't just about consultations. There's lots in the white paper. We've specifically designed it in that way that there were things that would be done through voluntary action. There were things that were done through other methods. So it's not purely kind of 60 consultations on 60 proposals. It's a real mixture of ways of implementing change so that we can do that in different ways at different speeds. And we can kind of prioritise where we can and get things done and make progress so that we see the impact of the proposals as quickly as possible.
While we're on the subject of timelines, Sarah, how much of what needs to be done from your perspective is at risk, if anything, from the relatively short amount of time we have left in this Parliament and a potential change of government if we do have one?
I obviously can't predict that, but partly that was why we wanted to do this mix of ways of implementing proposals so that we weren't heavily relying on primary legislation, which is obviously the most susceptible to any change in government. So the vast majority of our proposals are able to be done in a way that should be as protected as possible. You know, obviously there will be changes at some point, and we're kind of trying to plan on scenarios and thinking about how those might change. Would that mean that we want to kind of really prioritise certain things that we know will have the biggest impact? Do we need to kind of either group things or separate things to help them through the system? But we'll, at the moment, you know, we are working to the whole package, to the timeline that we set out in the white paper, and we'll keep doing that. And certainly kind of our meetings with ministers, meetings with number 10 have all been kind of prioritising getting all the proposals delivered as much as we can. And our big aim was to get the main proposals done by summer next year anyway. Okay.
I think we should move on to some of the key issues, because there are lots of them that would be good to discuss. Affordability, or as it's now known officially, financial risk checks, has generated, I think, the most interest. I'd like to bring the rest of the panel here in at this point. Bahal, what are your concerns? Good, or what are the good points perhaps as well around affordability? I mean, what do you think of the whole financial risk check policy as we understand it right now?
Thanks, Joe. Well, firstly, I welcome the Minister's confirmation last week, and also Andrew Rhodes recently in his FAQ blog on the Commission's website, that those checks will only be rolled out when government is confident that those checks can be delivered frictionlessly. As Dan and I acknowledged on this last webinar, there's no doubt extensive support in industry for levelling the playing field and providing consistency on these checks. So the positive thing to start with is the white paper was a positive and welcome acknowledgement from government that people should spend their dosh as they wish to do so, and that government wasn't going to set any universal rules on what percentage of a player's income should and could be permitted to be gambled with. However, as I think both Dan and I said the last time around, and Dan, feel free to keep me truthful on this, the challenge remains the implementation of the government's policy objective. And for me, the key issue here is the meaning of frictionless and whether it means consent free, and really the worrying disconnect between the government policy and practice, because it seems to me that the practical reality within industry is that there is going to be a significant drop-off rate after receiving a request for consent, whether that's consent for a credit reference agency check or open banking, or indeed to go through a manual check. And that is going to be, in my humble opinion, far more greater and higher than the amount that is modelled within Annex A of the white paper. And what we need to remember here is that DCMS achieved a great thing here and consulted extensively with stakeholders from all sides, and the clearly articulated, crystal clear policy objective is that those checks should be frictionless or largely frictionless. And now here we are trying to navigate our way through implementing government's policy objective. And as the minister acknowledged last week, if the Commission doesn't get this right, it will be very much open to challenge, which nobody wants, because it's going to significantly delay things. And I would welcome any insight that Tim can provide to us on the research that the Commission is commissioning at the same time and parallel, as I understand it, to the consultation on consumers' likely approach to being asked to consent, and also to hear more about the likely pilot that he also mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Tim, please elaborate if you can.
Yeah, sure. And I think that point about kind of consent to checks and how that interacts with the concept of friction is really, really important, and one that actually, as things are being developed, both kind of during the white paper process and subsequently, we and DCMS have been working quite closely with the Information Commissioner's Office to look at that process and how can you get an appropriate approach to consent that's in line with kind of data protection requirements, but that doesn't kind of drive the coaching horses through the concept of frictionless. And I think from the conversations we've had with ICO, there is a route through doing that. In relation to sort of the research we're doing, so actually I mean, a range of different approaches that we've taken. Most recently, kind of a series of, I suppose you call them focus groups, really, with kind of real consumers, understanding kind of their views on kind of a range of issues, and that will also feed in, and we'll be publishing the outcomes of that as well. I think what's been quite interesting is that when you do start to talk through some of the detail of what's being proposed, and as Andrew's sought to do in the last week or so with his blog, kind of bust some of the myths, actually the consumer perspective on some of this does change. I'm not going to pretend that suddenly all consumers are saying, yeah, this is fantastic, we love it, but I think there are a lot of myths that have developed out there. I think in fairness, some of that will be an indication of the need for us, DCMS, to do, an increasingly good job in how we communicate things. But I think, frankly, there sometimes has been some deliberate attempts to kind of misrepresent what's actually there. And I think when, particularly if we move on to a pilot phase, when people start to see the practical reality of how these things are working, I think some of the concerns will disappear. But I'm under no illusions. This is a really challenging area. I think this is probably one of the most kind of challenging things I've worked on since being at the Commission, and there'll be a bumpy road ahead. But I'm confident, particularly given the sort of the tone of the engagement that we've been having with operators, that actually together we can kind of find a route through that delivers the government's very clear policy objectives and delivers it in a way that is, one, effective, and two, does meet that need of being frictionless.
Thank you, Tim. Dan, any further thoughts on the financial checks? And I mean, how does a working group and a pilot sound as an approach to you?
Yeah, well, I'm notoriously a very bad person and very hard to please, but I've been pleasantly surprised on this call, as I was reading the transcript of the Select Committee the other week, for this idea of a trial to be suggested, because I think it's so obviously logical that we should test these things. And there's a very good opinion by the Harvard Medical School on this thing. It's similar in a way to, drug companies don't just push out drugs because they think they might work. We test these things. And so I think when we're making large scale interventions in a market that are going to affect large numbers of consumers, they should be tested and piloted. It strikes me, and Tim will say if I'm wrong, but that's an important piece of missing information from the consultation. It's not in there. So either for some reason it was omitted, or it's a sort of, or there's been a sort of set of, oh, this is complicated and perhaps we should do this. My money will be on the latter, if I'm being honest. I think the other thing, as Tim says, and I have some sympathy here, this is complicated. Why is it complicated? Because nobody's ever done this before, okay? You're not picking up something else that works in another part of the consumer economy and simply replicating it. So we're doing something to consumers that's really quite unusual, and that in itself should really give us cause for great caution where this is concerned, because they're important. Yes, we're trying to do something that helps people who may be at risk of suffering sometimes extreme harm, but we should also recognise there's very important principles of liberty and consumer freedom here. Not to mention the risk of perhaps further stigmatising what is still a legal activity for adults in this country. But yeah, so the best news I've heard is that this will be subject to a trial and a proper pilot, and that's as it should be. And really that should be, I think, extended as a sort of principle more generally to how we make changes to market regulation.
Chair, would I be able to just come in
yes,
on that?
absolutely. So,
just to give a bit more detail about sort of how we make this work. So I think one of the reasons why I think a pilot is only now sort of coming out is that certainly I think in all of the noise around the kind of the final steps around the white paper, apparently we weren't clear whether we could kind of get the buy-in to something like that. I think there'd been a fairly adversarial kind of phase between all sorts of people, and actually I think we started to move beyond that, which is good. And the environment is right for that sort of that type of kind of pilot approach. What we would probably need to do in order to enable it is, within the consultation, there are some provisions specifically around kind of data protection. And I think, so I need to avoid the risk of prejudging the consultations. I need to be slightly careful. But one of the approaches here would be that you actually bring some of the provisions in incrementally. So I think to allow a pilot to happen, we'd first of all need to bring in some of the provisions around data protection to give everyone the kind of the cover they need. But that doesn't mean we have to bring in the entirety of the provisions at the same time. So that's something we're looking at the moment, and getting some advice on as well, just to kind of, in effect, bring the parts of the provision that would unlock all of this, enable us to kind of test these things out, and then once we're comfortable, bring in the remainder of the provision.
Can I just jump in there, Tim? Thank you for providing some further insight on this concept of a pilot. And I don't wish for you to prejudge the consultation or say something that you're not able to do so at this stage. And I do welcome Dan's comment as well. I think Regulus actually framed it quite nicely yesterday, that a pilot is responsible regulation. So it's great to hear that we're all on the same page here. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, Tim, if you are able to share them, as to how that pilot might run and the likely participants, because plainly a pilot's not to be rolled out to everybody, and whether licensees that participate in the pilot will therefore be held to a higher standard during the pilot phase, and also how the Commission would evaluate the pilot if indeed it established that it wasn't workable.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think candidly on the detail, I just don't think we're there yet. I think what we're expecting is that the kind of the working group that I spoke about, that we hope we can get off the ground pretty shortly, can start to help kind of scope out how this might work. I think it's important that those that are directly involved with the implementation play a role in kind of developing that pilot. It's not just kind of enforced upon them. I think importantly, it won't just be kind of industry operators. We'll need to make sure that people in the financial services sector are a part of that as well. So I want to avoid the risk of kind of making, speaking on behalf of a whole range of people, but certainly that's something that we'll be sort of developing and taking forward over the coming weeks.
Sarah, what's DCMS's role going to be in the whole financial risk check situation? Frictionless is a term obviously emerged initially in the white paper. Will you have a role in signing off any policy that the Commission develops?
So I mean, I think we've been clear, and we'll continue to be clear, this is joint kind of policy making between us and the Commission, and that we are working very closely together. We've got a whole governance framework around the whole of the white paper, not just financial risk checks, so we will be involved. I think really important, we did actually hint at possibly a phased implementation within the white paper on financial risk checks, but admittedly that was one line in what was a very long document, so it's probably not surprising it didn't get picked up more broadly. But it's always been something that on this side that people have understood that could potentially be needed when, as we say, we're bringing in something that hasn't been used in other kind of regulations before. So very important, and will continue to be engaged. Obviously, kind of Stuart was talking at the select committee, but even just in the kind of couple of weeks between summer recess and conference recess, ministers have had multiple discussions with stakeholders, be it kind of MPs who are concerned, be it betters forums and kind of representatives of consumers, industry representatives as well. So it is very much something that heavily engaged in and will continue to be so.
Thank you. We've had a question in, and I don't know how well you'll be able to answer this, either Tim or Sarah, but I will ask it, and we can see. I mean, they've been asked to define frictionless. I mean, can you offer a definition of what frictionless means?
Sarah, do you want to go in terms of the white paper, and I'll come in from the regulatory perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I will firstly say that obviously kind of from our kind of original policy, the majority of consumers won't even be impacted by this policy. So that's pure frictionless. I think there is a question around frictionless. We see as being kind of nothing that puts in an obvious barrier in the way. There is that question of, we all sign up, particularly for online accounts. There is some friction in that anyway, in terms of signing up for T's and C's. So I think there is a question of, is it friction on that level that people kind of just accept as part of the way that people consume, or is it something above and beyond that really stands out? And I think that's probably what we mean by me defining this kind of purely on the foot here, is that frictionless we kind of see as being nothing beyond just the normal kind of way of working as a consumer in the online space. And then some friction would be something that goes beyond that. And obviously there is already a lot of kind of either checks or processes that happen anyway at the moment in this transitional period that are causing quite a lot more friction above just purely that we would expect just from kind of signing up to any other account on any other online platform.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think from our perspective, I suppose rather than sort of defining it as a term, what we have in our mind is that things that we're seeking to put in place don't create kind of further burdens on the consumer to actively do things. So, as Sarah said, there are already kind of things that consumers have to do either through the nature of opening an account or as a result of existing regulatory requirements. That operators will be asking consumers for particular information, perhaps to comply with things like their AML requirements. So those are already there. But in terms of the sort of proposals that the white paper makes, and then sort of how we plan to implement that, it's trying to ensure you do that in a way that isn't putting the burden on the consumer to be providing information to the operator. That we think the vast majority of this can be done without that need. We and the white paper acknowledge there may be a very small proportion of consumers where perhaps because they don't have credit reference history or things like that, there may be no option but to either seek information through something like open banking, or in those kind of very small percentage of cases. And I think the estimate we got from the financial services industry was that probably in excess of 90% of the people that would be caught by the enhanced checks would have sufficient information there to meet them. So we're talking very small proportion. And I think it's about being clear that the regulatory requirements are requirements that we're putting on operators. We're not imposing obligations on consumers. As Sarah has already said, the white paper doesn't talk about how much a consumer will be allowed to spend. It's not about kind of limiting a consumer to a specified amount. It's about making sure that operators are understanding their consumers, are aware of any unaffordable gambling in a consistent way, because we've known from previous webinars and elsewhere that there has been inconsistency in how some of that's been done.
Okay, thank you very much. We could, I think, talk about affordability for the entire session, and we may come back to it with some audience questions, but in the interest of covering some of the other areas, I think let's move on. And thank you to those who've sent questions so far, and a reminder for anyone who joined after I mentioned it that you can do so through the little panel that you should have available to you. And this is a subject that I think has caught the public attention much less, but so far as our audience is concerned, it is still very important, and that's the consultation around regulatory panels. Certainly, enforcement is a trend, has been a trend in the UK over the last few years, and captures a lot of attention, certainly from our users. Baha, I'm going to come to you first. I know you have some thoughts on the way that regulatory panels are set up now and how they should be set up in the future. I mean, what's your view of the consultation and how you'd like to see things go?
Well, it probably won't come as a surprise to hear from the only lawyer on this webinar that I have serious concerns about the proposals to firstly use adjudicators with only a minimum of 5 years legal experience, and secondly to change the default of the regulatory panel to paper-based decisions, of course subject to a fairness test where someone may have an oral hearing. The title of this webinar is Defining the Future, and my view is that this proposed change suggests that the future is not bright, because the regulatory panel is an important opportunity to challenge a decision. It is sometimes the only avenue of recourse when the Commission is going against you. I acknowledge that it's a small and restricted avenue of recourse, but it is an important one that shouldn't be further eroded. And if we take a step back a moment and look at the regulatory landscape, the Commission is doing this, with all due respect to Tim, at the same time as escalating fines and sanctions. And in this country, there are about 90 or so statutory regulators in this country. The Commission is one of them. How many of them, we should ask, can impose limitless fines, commence criminal proceedings, and decide to close multi-million-pound businesses, including overnight sometimes? And the other important thing to remember here, which I think the Commission fails to acknowledge in its consultation, although I do accept the Commission's viewpoint that the panel is still, in fact, the Commission. The regulatory panel is an important accountability mechanism for Commission employees when those employees are making decisions under their delegated powers. And effective regulation requires effective accountability. And in my opinion, the Commission is removing a weakening mechanism which holds the Commission to account on its own policies, procedures, and the law. I could go on and say a lot more, and I'm sure Tim will say, rightly so, that applicants and licensees will still be able to appeal to the first tier tribunal, but that's a lengthy, uncertain and expensive process. And I simply don't accept the Commission's view that sites that unrepresented applicants and licensees attend hearings and find it stressful, and thereby that's a reason to change the default, because to me it seems obvious that one should then have a policy on dealing with litigants in person. And I think the possible benefit, which is an obvious one, of reaching possibly quicker decisions will be far than outweighed by the disadvantages of going in this direction. And quite frankly, I find it very frightening and concerning that someone with 5 years legal experience, that's not gambling experience, would be making a decision to impose a sanction of £20 million or closing a business.
Tim, with quite detailed thoughts, but is there anything you could come back on there?
Yeah, so I suppose on the final point there, obviously commissioners, many of them, indeed at times perhaps none of them, will have any legal experience. So I think, adjudicators with 5 years legal experience may be more than some of the current commissioners. But obviously, like other things, conscious this is consultation. So again, not prejudging that, and we'll assess the responses that we've had. You would expect me to say that the Gambling Commission thinks this is the right change to make for the reasons that were set out in the consultation paper, particularly I think the increasing volume of work, ensuring that the concept of natural justice covers lots of areas. The fairness of the approach, the robustness of the approach, absolutely key to that. But similarly, ensuring that people that are subject to regulatory action do get reasonably swift outcomes, clearly not at the expense of the robustness of that. And I think when you consider that commissioners themselves are, as part of their appointment, are actually appointed for quite a small number of days per year, I think either you grow the size of the commission to get more capacity, and obviously that in itself would be a decision that the government would have to make because they appoint more commissioners, or you look at the sort of approach that we've proposed in the consultation paper. As I say, though, we'll consider all the responses that we get, all the evidence, and obviously the commission will then make a final decision on that basis. But say, like with all the others, it is a genuine consultation.
Can I make 2 observations there, Joe? I don't want to hijack the session, but just to respond.
You can make them if they take less than 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Well, firstly, I take the point about natural justice, Tim, but there are lots of other models of adjudication and running hearings. And I say this as someone that worked within the fitness to practice department of the healthcare regulator. I see that the Commission has referenced very, very briefly other models such as the GMC and so on, but there's no matrix comparing the powers of those regulators, the different models that the Commission has looked at. It's simply the Commission has now decided that this is the way forward. And my second point that I'll make very briefly is I welcome your confirmation, and also Andrew's last week before the DCMS committee, that consultation means meaningful consultation and not just an illusion. But this particular issue on regulatory panels was consulted on in 2020, and the Commission's decision in 2021 ploughed ahead despite the overwhelming majority of respondents disagreeing with the Commission's proposal. So history tells us here, unfortunately, that the Commission isn't listening to respondents.
I'm going to move us on, if that's okay. Because I think we could talk about
this
for a
very
long time.
quickly respond?
Yes, sorry, very quickly, Tim, come.
Very quickly. So just to say, because it's a genuine consultation, important to say, the Commission hasn't decided this is what we'll do. We've proposed this is what we'll do, and we'll listen to that. I do think it's important with consultations, though, that it is not like a referendum where the numbers on one side automatically win the argument. What we're focused on is not just the number of responses, but the nature of the responses, the evidence that we're given, the views are expressed. So there will be consultations where you may get lots of responses on one side of an argument. That isn't necessarily going to be persuasive when you've got perhaps some very strong evidence or arguments on the other side. But as I say, don't prejudge where we'll land with this. We'll review all the responses as they come in.
Okay, thank you both. Let's talk a little bit about the levy, the responsible gambling levy. If I could bring Sarah in here on this, something that's going to be looked at, as you said earlier, in detail by DCMS. I mean, do you expect to propose what amount the levy should be, or a range of different options?
So what we're looking at the moment is we already have secondary legislation powers to implement a statutory levy, and actually the powers themselves just look at the kind of they actually give us quite a broad range of options in terms of how we bring in the levy. They kind of say we can bring in a set limit, or we can bring in a formula, or we can do it in whatever way we want to. So what we're expecting the consultation to include is an idea of what that formula might look like. And we mentioned in the white paper that we'll be looking at both the kind of harm related to different parts of the sector, the costs, running costs of different parts of the sector, and bringing them all into consideration when we look at in terms of what percentage different types of businesses contribute to that statutory levy. So that will be part of it. And that will has been largely kind of talked about. I don't think will come as a massive surprise to anyone, because most people have been kind of estimating this. We're largely basing it kind of on what the voluntary levy is already there and building on that, rather than kind of coming up with something completely new. And then we'll be talking about kind of what we think that the governance and logistics will be around the levy as well. The consultation will probably look quite short compared to what the statutory levy actually is in terms of such a Andrew mentioned a generational change in how we operate in gambling, but that's because we're trying to focus it on what we need to do for the secondary legislation. There'll be wider work and working groups and close working with everyone involved that's kind of alongside that consultation process. So trying to just do that balance between how do we get the things that we need for the legislative requirements, as well as talking through how we actually operate this in practice when we do need to bring it in quite a constrained environment, in terms of we don't have primary legislation to change the system, we don't have new bodies to set up, we don't have lots of resources obviously to kind of put to this. So it's really a how do how do we turn the voluntary system into put it on a statutory footing to start with, and then is there room for more broader reforms in the future?
Okay, thank you. Dan, thoughts on what you've heard there and the levy in general, and also how you think the money that's gathered should be used?
I've never really understood the rationale for a levy. From a treatment perspective, all other mental health disorders are treated via state funding, and charities can plug the gaps where they exist. There's a lot of research money been made available certainly in the last 5 years. It's not clear to me that we need a levy for research. So I don't understand the basis for it. It also seems to me a fairly inefficient way of going about things, because if we need money ring-fenced to pay for these services, then I don't understand why taxation isn't simply adjusted and the Treasury commit to ring fencing. So it strikes me as setting this up seems inefficient and out of kilter with the way we generally fund research and healthcare services in this country, unless, and perhaps this is the same as financial risk checks, but potentially the new world we're moving towards is where consumers who participate in certain activities are required to pay certain taxes in order to pay for research into their activities and treatment of disorders related to those activities. And maybe also in future, consumers more generally will have to pass financial risk checks in order to spend their money, whether frictionless or not. But you know, it's happening. So there's nothing, I disagree with it, is kind of irrelevant. The big fear, I think, which is probably around research, and that's, you know, we've seen almost as soon as the levy was announced, we've had a number of fairly high profile researchers, some of whom work with the Gambling Commission, make statements around nobody who's involved with the gambling industry should be able to conduct any research, let alone access this money. So there's a real fear, I think, that a money tree is being planted here, which ultimately will not be used for the benefit of consumers, but actually will be used for the benefit of people who have a moral distaste for gambling. And that's the big fear. Now, it's a DCMS consultation, and I think Sarah and her team are brilliant. So I have a lot of faith that they're going to put in place suitable governance measures around this to stop those abuses. My fear is that, you know, DCMS has a lot under its umbrella. It will pay attention to these issues in the immediate term. If the Gambling Act, the experience of the Gambling Act 2005 is anything to go by, it does have a habit of wandering off and looking at other things in time. And my fear is that we need to maintain absolute vigilance over this to stop the abuse of monies being put in there. And what the other thing, again, I said I'm very hard to please, but the other thing that's pleased me greatly in the last couple of weeks has been Andrew Rhodes's letter to the Select Committee, where he calls out information. And I think that's really important that the regulator takes a strong view on that. It does seem that some people are deliberately thumbing their noses at the Commission over that, and we expect to see enforcement on that, I think. But that gives me some comfort that the Commission is prepared to call out those who misuse research and statistics.
Sarah, any thoughts on the governance and whether the DCMS might lose interest in the levy in the long run?
I mean, we obviously won't. I think this is a part of actually being a statutory levy means it will therefore bestow power, responsibilities on us to be accountable and transparent on what the statutory levy is funding. So actually it will create more accountability in the system and more stability in the system, so that it won't be something that is kind of lost. And I think it, you know, as Dan said, it isn't the way that other areas are funded, but that's because we don't have that history of, we've got a history of a voluntary levy, we've not got it. And I think it's a way of bringing in change, say, kind of as quickly as possible. Whereas if we did try and go through something that was much more significant in terms of health funding taxation, it would take a lot longer. So it's a way of kind of using the system as it is, making it stable, making it something that is accountable and transparent, and using that as the kind of next step forward.
As Dan mentioned, we've seen the Commission recently calling out misuse of statistics as it sees it, which to me raises the question of how much of that externally produced evidence either the Commission or DCMS relies on for its decision making. I mean, Tim, maybe to you first on that. I mean, there is a lot of misinformation out there, or a lot of stuff that's produced that way. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, and Ash, if we try to tackle all of the misinformation, I'd probably need a whole kind of directorate doing that, you know, all the time. We're focusing primarily on where there's misuse of official statistics, because that's something we ourselves have some ownership over, and you know, arguably, you know, we should be the authority as to kind of what those statistics say. So that's been our focus, and you know, frankly, all sides of the debates in this have you know, had a go at that. So, you know, the letter that Dan references to the select committee picked up industry, it picked up campaigners, it, in a slightly brave move when you're about to go in front of the committee, it picked up the MPs themselves. So, you know, we will continue to be robust in defending those statistics. In terms of the wider evidence base, you know, we look at the entirety of what's out there and then form a judgment as to, you know, how robust or persuasive that is. And you'll see in our advice to government on the white paper, we set out the sort of evidence that we considered. We put in place a robust sort of evidence assurance framework, so that when we were looking at each area of the forthcoming white paper, we were looking at, you know, what evidence is out there, how robust it is, actually what gaps exist as well. And I think particularly where we've identified gaps in the evidence base, we've set out sort of earlier this year sort of our priorities for kind of future research to try and fill some of those gaps. And you know, we recognise that there will be evidence out there that perhaps is not that strong, maybe because its independence has been affected, but not always. And I do think sometimes the perception of independence of this research overtakes the reality of the value of some of it. I've seen some really high quality research that's been, you know, arguably funded by industry, and I think that research is still valuable. I've seen research that has not had industry anywhere near it and has not been of great value, and I've seen kind of reverse of both those as well. So I think you have to take everything on its kind of on its own merit, assess the weight, and then look at the entirety of the evidence base that's there.
Sarah, is that the DCMS's approach?
Yeah, and certainly, and you know, we our ministers have been very clear that the white paper as a whole was an evidence-based approach. That partly because something like gambling isn't very kind of politically driven one way or another. It's often actually quite a good thing that we can get ministers to properly kind of look at the evidence, and the same as Tim said, it doesn't mean that we take all evidence into account in the same level and give it all the same weight. We will be looking at it all, but there will be some that does land easier and has more of an effect than others. There are obviously gaps in the evidence, and that's one of the things that through the statutory levy we can have a bit more of that structure around what are the research priorities alongside the Gambling Commission's own research priorities, and how do we just kind of formulate that in a bit more of a way and have more of a say from a central government point of view as well around what those priorities are.
Joe, sorry, can I ask a couple more questions? So I think they're both for Tim actually. Where you've called out misuse of statistics in relation to specific parties and they continue to misuse statistics, will you refer them to the OSR? That's my first question. The second question.
Yeah.
Sorry, my second question is, if statistics are misrepresented in any of the consultation documents, will those consultation documents have to be revised and recirculated?
So on the first one, I mean, whether we will always refer everybody to the Office of Statistics Regulator, I think we'll need to make a call as to what impact we think it has. But I can say that we've already done such a referral around misuse of statistics. In relation to the consultation documents, I'm not aware of. Are you talking about our consultation documents here?
Well, I'll follow up afterwards, perhaps, and let you know where I think we have some concerns. But I'm just interested in the principle of what you would do under those circumstances.
Yeah. So generally, I haven't kind of considered that question. I suppose what sits behind it is I recognise that as we take a more robust approach around statistics, we ourselves will rightly be put more under the spotlight as to how we use statistics, how we use the evidence base, and that's that's no bad thing. We won't ourselves always get that totally right. I think particularly in sort of live environments like this as well. I mean, one of the things I was terrified about last week, having sort of written to the select committee, is that in the heat of the moment, I end up misusing statistics myself because, I think some of the times it is genuinely done accidentally. I think a number of the ones that we pulled out, I don't think you can call them accidental. So I certainly have no problem with people sort of questioning where we've done that. Dan, you and I have had conversations about sort of examples of that, and welcome that. I think in particular our stats team themselves recognise that sort of external challenge continues to kind of drive up our standards as well. So certainly we won't shy away from that sort of challenge.
I'll close with an audience question that's come in. I think this is for Tim as well. Around asking for an individual's job title on the as part of the financial risk checks. The contention of the question is that's not a normal piece of information that might cause a bit of mental friction, at least to a consumer. I mean, what's the thinking around that at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said earlier, it's one of the areas where we've already had some input, and I think certainly we are looking at that. And the reason why it was included in there was that in some of our pre-consultation engagement, we had a number of operators, when we were talking about some of these checks, saying that actually they ask for that information. They think it's valuable. I mean, in one case, I think we have one operator suggesting that it could be used as an alternative to financial risk checks altogether. I don't think that was ever going to be the case. So that was one of the reasons we included it, and specifically asked a question around that, because we wanted to understand, one, kind of, was this something that was routinely being asked for? And I think the responses we're getting is no, it's probably not being asked for routinely. And two, the sort of value people felt that it added. So there's a specific question in there quite deliberately, and I'm sort of, as I say, trying very carefully not to prejudge the consultation, but clearly you can tell from this is one of the areas that we'll be sort of looking at.
Okay, well, I think we are pretty close to time, so I'll just say thank you very much to all of you for watching, and very, very special thanks to the panel for your thoughts and input, and I'll hand things back over to Jack to close us out.
Yeah, just thank you very much for all of the speakers for your great insight. It was very entertaining to watch. As mentioned at the start of the session, I'd just like to remind all attendees this webinar was recorded and a video will be sent to you in the coming days. Before we sign off, I just wanted to let you know how you can get more information on Vixio and meet the team. If you're based in Europe and attending the SBC Summit in Barcelona next week, be sure to visit stand ME110, where the on-site team will be happy to provide more information. And for those who are based in North America and visiting G2E in Las Vegas in October, be sure to visit the Vixio stand 3611, where myself and the Vixio team would love to show you how the gambling compliance platform works in more detail. Should you have any questions, or you asked a question that wasn't unable to be answered due to time, can I please direct you to the email address info@vixio.com, where we'll put the questions to our in-house experts as well as any external parties. And for more information, please visit vixio.com. Thank you again for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Goodbye.